Everyone, my name is Katie Arwood. I am the MCC Library Director, and today we are so fortunate on behalf of MCC Reads to have a veteran of the Civil War.
Thank you. I'm Private R.E. Stone, a veteran soldier of the 7th Michigan Infantry, Army of the Potomac during the War of the Southern Rebellion. I am here today to tell you some aspects of what life was like for me and hundreds of thousands of other men and some women in this country during that conflict. Before I speak, it is my practice to toast the men of my regiment. We served from the summer of 1861 to the summer of 1865. Just over 1,000 of us left Fort Wayne in Detroit at the beginning of our military service. Fully a third of us did not come home. Half of that third died of disease. Some of my friends never even got to see a battle. They got smallpox, they got measles. When we were at Fort Wayne all together, it was very easy for boys who had lived in the isolation of a farm all their lives to catch these maladies. And there was no protection against it. The treatment for it was at best rudimentary. So I would ask for a moment of silence, respectful silence, as I toast my friends. Thank you. Why should anybody want to talk about the war 30 years after it ended? After all, shouldn't we put it behind us? The horror, the sacrifice, the loss? You may have heard of an author named Walt Whitman. Well, back in '75, he is supposed to have said, "The real war will never get in the books." Why would he say that? If you go into a bookshop today, in 1896, the volumes you see that deal with the war are almost exclusively written by politicians or generals. It is very unusual to see a history written by someone like me, who was actually in the line of battle for 4 years. What motivated men like me to go to war in 1861? I have a poem that I will quote an excerpt from that I think describes our situation very accurately. It was a time of great and exalting excitement. The country was up in arms. The war was on. In every breast burned the holy fire of patriotism. The drums were beating, the bands playing, toy pistols popping, the bunched firecrackers hissing and spluttering. On every hand and far down the receding and fading spread of roofs and balconies, a fluttering wilderness of flags flashed in the sun. Daily, the young volunteers marched down the wide avenue. Gay and fine in their new uniforms, the proud fathers and mothers and sisters and sweethearts cheering them with voices choked with happy emotions as they swung by. Nightly, the packed mass meetings listened, panting, to patriot oratory, which stirred the deepest deeps of their hearts, and which they interrupted at briefest intervals with cyclones of applause, the tears running down their cheeks all the while. In the churches, the pastors preached devotion to flag and country, and invoked the God of battles, beseeching his aid in our good cause in outpouring of fervid eloquence, which moved every listener. It was indeed a glad and gracious time. Why did men like me want to go to war? Well, we were patriotic. We loved our country. We didn't want the rebels to tear it asunder and have their own slave-based nation. So we wanted to preserve the Union. Now, some of us had anti-slavery feelings. I had rarely seen Negroes in Mason, Michigan, where I'm from. But as the war went on, I understood that that was as much of a cause for our campaigns as anything else. As I said, most of us lived on farms, isolated, just there with our families. And a lot of us just got tired having a life that meant following the southbound end of a northbound plow horse. What everyone believed at first, I mean everybody, north and south, is that the war would be decided by one big battle. That's all it would take. Then one side would lose and the other side would have won. Reality was very different. After the Battle of First Bull Run in July of 1861, everybody with half a brain knew that the enterprise was going to last longer. Nobody knew that it would last for 4 years. That was impossible. How could that be? But it's what happened. First, I will start talking about what I wore. The men on the other side wore pretty much the same thing, except their uniforms were gray or butternut. One thing you have to understand is when the war broke out, there were only about 16,000 men in all branches of the United States Army. And they were spread over the entire continent. There were many men, professionals who remained in the United States Army. There were many men who chose to break their oath of service to the Constitution and join the Confederate Army. But what a lot of that meant was, until a while passed, many of the men were wearing the same uniform, regardless of what side they were on. At Bull Run, there were former federal officers who had joined the Confederacy, who were dressed in federal blue. It caused a great deal of confusion on the battlefield. Before I was mustered into the Federal Army, I was, like many fellows, a member of the Militia company. These were all over the place. Ours, in Mason, had been founded by a veteran of the war with Mexico in the 40s. His name was Canteens. My mother sewed for me a very nice uniform in Militia gray wool. It had black cuffs and black collar accents. What was the purpose of the militia units before the war. It's not as glorious as one might think. We would get together regularly. We would march around the town square a little bit for a while. We might, if we had weapons, practice sharpshooting. But the most important aspect of our meetings was going to the tavern afterward. So things quickly became very different when we were in the true United States Army. When I got to Fort Wayne, I sent home my militia uniform, which grieved my mother greatly because sewing it had been a labor of love for her. But then I was given clothes like this: dark gray sack coat, 4 buttons, light blue or sky blue trousers, stockings, and brogans or boots. So we were all then uniform because we were all wearing the same kind of clothing. Now, one of the pieces of equipment we were issued was this hat called a kepi. For a while, it seems, the United States Army was enthralled by the French Army. I don't know why, but French soldiers wore this kind of cap. It's made of wool, just as my sack coat is made of wool, my trousers are made of wool, my stockings are made of wool. Very good in the depths of winter, not so comfortable at the height of summer. But it was the only kind of clothing we were issued for the whole 4 years. And we were not given new uniforms very often. So by 1864, you would have been hard put to tell apart a Federal division and a Confederate division, because there were rips in our clothing. There might be patches on our coat elbows. Many of us did not have boots, and we marched in our bare feet. Back to the kepi. You can easily see how useless this item was. Whether you're talking about marching in the summer or talking about marching in the rain, it offered no protection to your neck or your ears. And indeed, even this narrow little brim was of no use in protecting your face from the elements. Then, the war hadn't been going on too long before fellows like me experienced an unusual thing. Somehow, we lost our kepis. How could that be? They belonged to the government. How could we lose them? That was rather irresponsible, but that didn't bother us too much. Instead, we replaced kepis with a far more useful type of hat. They didn't all look like this, but generally speaking, they were all called slouch hats. Contrast this with what I just had on. This piece of headgear has a wide brim that encircles my entire head, so that when it is raining, as today, my face, my ears, my neck don't get wet. One thing, however, that we soldiers used either kind of hat for was to do what was called foraging. Now, those of us in the Federal Army were fed pretty well in comparison to our southern brethren, whose government had a very hard time, especially as the war went on, supplying their basic needs of food. But we had two types of foraging. There was official foraging, where we might visit a southern farm and fill our hats with peaches or apples, what have you, and one of our officers would write out a receipt to the lady of the house, who was under the illusion then that the United States government would pay for what we liberated from her farm. I hope she had a lot of luck. But there was another kind of foraging, and that was unauthorized foraging. The result was the same. Soldiers would be going along, marching down a road. We'd spy an orchard to one side or the other, and we'd break out of the ranks and go and fill our hats with something that we could eat when the unit stopped for the night. Now, the uniform itself. It's 4 buttons. It is lined with wool. You wouldn't want to not have enough wool, after all. And the pants, the trousers, had 2 pockets, which was very useful. And then we had stockings and brogans, or boots. Now, it was against the law for any man to be mustered into the Federal Army until he was 18 years old. In 1861, I was 16. I wasn't going to let that stop me serving my country. So what did I do? Well, a lot of the boys talked about how to get around this, how to dodge this ridiculous law. And what we did was, when time came for us to be recruited formally, before that happened, before we went before the recruiting officer, we would remove one of our boots, we would take a piece of foolscap and a crayon perhaps, and we would write the numbers 1 and 8 on the paper, like this. Then we would put the paper into our boot and put it back on. So then, when it was my turn to stand before the recruiting officer, he said, "Young man, surely you know that one must be 18 years of age before he can be mustered into the Federal Army. Are you 18 years of age?" And because I had the slip of paper with the number 18 in my shoe, I could raise my hand and honestly say, "Yes, sir, I am over 18. The recruiting officers must have learned about that. How could they not, since so many of us were doing it? But I don't know of anyone who was asked to take off their footwear and prove that they did not have an incriminating piece of paper under their stocking. Our foot gear was made of leather, of course. And at that time, the practice of creating shoes that were dedicated to the size of the left foot or the right foot were only starting out. In many occasions, we had to wear our footwear long enough that use and all that marching changed its shape for us. Now these brogans have slick bottoms. Very difficult to march in mud or through deep sand or in snow. There were ways of trying to deal with that too that I'll show you, but they were pretty uniformly unsuccessful. This is a heel plate. Kind of looks like a horseshoe, doesn't it? And we would go to the sutler. The sutler was a type of itinerant thief or merchant, I should say, that followed the armies around and sold us all manner of useful and unuseful things. But I bought a pair of these and they got knocked on, and I would have been just as well off if I never had them. So it goes. Now, in recent times, men have started to wear belts on their trousers. When I was a boy, we never had anything like that. If we had a belt or a piece of rope or twine, it was outside of our shirt or our coat. But this belt I was issued was really where I carried a lot of the tools of my trade as a killer, as someone trained to take human life over 4 years of war. What was on it? Well, on the left-hand side in a scabbard is another useless piece of military equipment, a bayonet that I'll show you later was put on the nozzle end of my rifle musket. Why was this piece of steel of no benefit, of no value in a military sense? Perhaps you have seen lithographs in places like Harper's Weekly of brave lines of troops charging the enemy with bayonets on the end of their muskets. I won't say that didn't happen, because in war, anything can and usually does happen. But I never did this. Why not? Well, as again I will show you, having this fixed on the end of your musket made it very difficult to reload. It just got in the way. Oh well, we didn't throw this away. So what did we do with it? We used it as a tent peg. Men would be supplied a shelter half of canvas, and you and one of your pards at the end of the day would button that up along the ridgepole, maybe get a tree branch to set up and uprights from woods nearby to set up your pole, and then you would use these to stake down the grommets that lined the edge of the tent. Another thing that we used it for was when we got to camp and we were settling down for the evening, we would jam this in the ground. We would take a candle and put it in the socket and set it alight. We didn't carry around lanterns, but this worked well enough for us to see what we were doing. Other items we had were for our rifle musket use. We had a cartridge box that carried 40 rounds of ammunition in 2 tins, like this. You would have 20 rounds loose in the top so that you could get to them right away in an engagement. And then you had a paper-wrapped package called an arsenal pack of 20 more rounds. when you were out of ammunition in the top of the tins, you took one of these out, tore it open, and stuffed the rounds into the top. It was rare for us to be in a battle that required that much ammunition. It just didn't happen very often. If there was a long duration stand-up fight, and men were starting to run low of ammunition, the quartermasters would drag up boxes that each carried 1,000 cartridges, again, packed into those 20-round arsenal packs. But that didn't happen very often. We also had a percussion cap pouch. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but I'll explain it again when I talk about my weapon. These, you might be able to see, are about the shape of Abe Lincoln's stovepipe hat. When my grandfather went to the War of the Revolution, the kind of weapon he had was primitive compared to what people like me had. He had a smooth bore musket which took round leaden balls over ½ an inch in diameter. The firing mechanism was also primitive in that it had a pan on the side into which he would pour gunpowder and then snap down a cover. But before he could shoot it, he had to take off or remove that cover. And so if it was raining, the powder might get damp or wet. If it was windy, it might just blow away. And then he had to start all over again in preparing his weapon for firing. Very inconvenient if someone across the way is trying to kill you. Other things that I carried, as a matter of course, were of course a canteen that holds a quart of water. You can go for quite some time without food, but you can't go for very long without water. So finding water daily and filling our canteens was one of the things uppermost in our minds. Where did we find water? Did the government bring along wagons with big tin storage tanks from which we could fill our canteens? No. We had to find water where we could. Now, sometimes we were lucky. There might be a spring of fresh water. There might be a well on a farm we were passing by. A pond, which worked pretty well if you pushed aside any of the scum that was on the top of it. And of course, there were rivers. There were a lot of rivers in Virginia. At first, there was a problem with getting water from rivers many times. We would camp for a night, get our tent set up, and then go to refill our canteens. The problem was, for a while, for too long a while, the engineers would dig our latrines upstream of where we dunked in our canteens to get water. And the result of that was a lot of unpleasantness, a lot of sickness. Thankfully, some genius finally figured that out. But for a while, it was a chancy situation to drink the water out of your canteen. Another important thing was this, our haversack. Now, as I had mentioned earlier, the United States Army did a far better job of provisioning its troops than the Confederacy did. So I could pretty much depend on getting 3 basic items issued, if not daily, at least on a regular basis. There was salt pork or salt beef. It was salted like they do in the Navy to keep it from going rancid. We prepare the salt pork by scraping the salt off the top of it. Then we take a coffee pot and dunk the meat in the water as long as we could to get rid of more of the salt that had permeated the fibers of the meat. Then we would take a knife and cut up in little pieces, and we would fry it in most cases. Not always a gourmet meal, but it kept you going. The third thing we relied on was coffee. The Army would issue coffee to us in beans that were either green, meaning that we would have to roast them ourselves over the campfire before we could make coffee, and sometimes they issued it to us already roasted. To make our coffee, we would have a little sack in our haversacks to carry the beans, and we would dump some into our cup. Then we would take that useless piece of military equipment and crush the beans with the socket of the bayonet. You would grind it to taste. You couldn't guarantee that it would be a fine grind since the way you were doing it manually. Then you would either put the coffee in a pot if you had time, or you might put it into this item called a mucket. As you can see, it's quite commodious. It would hold a lot of water. So you would set that a boiling, and through experience, when you knew it was done, you might or might not skim the grounds off the surface of the liquid, and then you had your coffee. Another thing we did, because it had an effect that no one has been able to explain to me, when we were on the march, if you were feeling tired, not uncommon, you might reach in your haversack and pull out a handful of beans and pop them into your mouth and chew them as you went along the road. For some reason, that invariably made me feel better. It put a spring in my step. I don't know why, but I didn't really care because it worked. Now inside the haversack itself, you would have a plate of some kind, and this was for your food, cooking your food, eating your food. This was also an entrenching tool. We did not receive shovels to dig trenches. As the war went on, instead of standing up in long lines, sometimes with bayonets on our muskets, and charging the enemy, who was happy to take the opportunity to shoot us down, by 64, certainly in 65, when we went into battle and the enemy began to shoot, let off a volley, we would immediately go to ground. If you were lucky, maybe you would find a tree or some bushes to hide behind. You couldn't always count on that though. So what we would do when we got down, lying down, is take the plate out of our haversack and start digging. Were we going to be able to dig deep enough and long enough and wide enough to offer our bodies protection against the incoming ammunition? No. But there was something in your mind that once you were able to dig a little hillock of dirt that you could scooch down behind, somehow you were going to be safe. It was a trick of the mind, nothing more. There was a different kind of plate we would get sometimes. When a man had a canteen that sprung a leak, we might throw it onto the campfire. And when the metal got hot enough to melt the solder around the circumference, we could prise it apart, and then there would be, as a result, 2 plates. And you could, as I did, tie this onto your canteen. So it was very convenient in that regard. Other things. Almost everybody, well, I would say everybody, had a spoon, at least, to eat with. But that wasn't the very best thing that you could have. So I was fortunate that one of those robber settlers in a winter camp in '62 to find this item. It is a spoon. It is a fork. And it is a knife. And you could take it apart, have the knife separately. If you needed the spoon, you kept the fork folded in. And vice versa, if you needed the fork, but not the spoon. These were highly prized. They cost real money, for one thing. But you always had to make sure that your erstwhile friends didn't try to steal it from you. Because then you'd be back to square one, and you'd have to rely on the old-fashioned spoon or buy another one of these. What did we eat? I've given some examples, but the easiest answer to give you that encompasses a wide range of time and experience, we ate everything we could get our hands on. Whether rations from the government, items that we had liberated from farms, things we bought from the settlers. The last was one we wanted to avoid as best we can, because we only got paid $13 a month, and we were always being told to send a lot of that money home, which most of us did. But that left us with only maybe $3 or $4 to tide us over until the next payday. There's one story I know of which is emblematic of the soldier's experience and decision making toward food during the war. I heard about an officer who one day was wandering through an abandoned camp. And he came to where there was, at one time, a campfire. Just ashes, trash all around it. And he happened to spy a tin can, an open tin can. Being of a curious nature, he picked it up and looked inside it. And by gum, it was filled with rancid bacon grease. Now, we might say, ugh, and throw it away. Did he do that? Anything but. He took a spoon out of his pocket and with great relish ate all of the grease. Would you do that? In the right circumstances, you would. I promise. Now, when the war started, a lot of us were sent out with all manner of folderol, useless items, water purifiers that didn't work. There was a regiment from New York City who was given by the great steakhouse Domenico's. Each man received a footstool for those hours you would be whiling away in the evening in camp. Very solicitous of them, very, very thoughtful. However, the uselessness of that equipment became evident even to the most wealthy son of New York, whose regiment marched out from the city when the war began. I reckon a lot of those footstools ended up in campfires where they did good service. So it wasn't a total loss. There were men that had backpacks, actual packs that they wore on their backs to carry. They were their own pack mules. They carried all these things that the folks at home thought they needed to have to go and do their work as a soldier. But as the war went on, and as a man got through perhaps being ill, got through his first couple of battles without being wounded or killed, he realized that the less he carried, the better off he was going to be. You might say, well, didn't the Army quartermaster supply wagons into which we could store knapsacks, backpacks, and other things so that we could retrieve them later on? Of course not. Indeed, if you did have the opportunity to put some of your personal possessions in one of those light blue painted quartermaster wagons, you might as well wave goodbye to it, because the chances of you seeing it ever again were practically nil. So we focused on carrying our food in our knapsack and our utensils and plates, carrying the stuff we needed for our weapons, carrying our canteens, and maybe a few other bits and pieces here and there. Because you knew that you had all that you needed. And you didn't have to rely on the Army to do pretty much anything except give you your rations. One of the interesting things we were given to eat, I must say that we were regularly issued not just the coffee and the salted meat, but if you had nothing else in your knapsack to eat, you would have several squares of this. This is called hardtack. Again, thanks to the Navy, this was inflicted upon us in the Army as well. The recipe for this is so simple that a child could make it. It consists of flour, water, and a little salt. And then it was baked until it would survive in the fires of Haiti. We called it sheet iron crackers because they could chip your tooth. Now, if you had nothing else, you had this. And many's the time, marching along, without thinking, I would listen to my stomach growl and I'd pour one of these out of my haversack and have a go at it. The good thing was, it was so hard that it took a long time to consume. So it could last you a whole afternoon, and you only needed one. Now there's a phrase that's come about in recent times that some of you might have heard. People say they've got their 3 square meals a day. Although I rather doubt, so long after the war, that many civilians are interested in partaking of this delicacy. But we didn't just eat it the way it came. It came from contractors who shipped 1,000-piece crates of it to the Army supply depots. These crates, wooden crates, they were left outside in the heat and in the rain or whatever moisture fell from the sky. So by the time the hardtack was actually issued to men like me, it might be a hotel for vermin. Now at face value you might say, oh, that's awful. Didn't you turn in your wormy hardtack for a fresh piece? No, because there wasn't any fresh piece of hardtack. And your corporal, your sergeant, would either laugh at you or look at you like you'd lost your mind. This is what you were issued. This is what you shall eat. Now, other uses for hardtack, besides harboring vermin, was as an element of our cooking. We might take, again, our bayonet or a knife or something and crackle it up into pieces and put it into water in our bucket and boil the water. It made kind of a starter for soups. So you would put this in the water, boil the water, then you might cut up some of that infamous salt pork and dump it in, and you'd have a stew. Again, throughout the war, we were not focused on eating in a high-class manner. We were focused on eating to get through the next day, whatever that took. One item, a nefarious item, that someone devised, and if I ever meet that someone, we'll have a talk. It was called Desiccated Vegetables. The process was very scientific for manufacturing this commodity. They would take carrot tops, beets, onions, all kinds of vegetables like that. They dry them out, then they would compress them into blocks. So you would end up with a block of this silage that was maybe as big as this. And when you were to prepare this, you broke off a chunk and you, again, put it in that ever useful coffee pot of boiling water. And you waited until it sprouted. Again, I said it was like silage people had on the farm. And then you would try to eat it with predictable results. We avoided it however we could. So upset were we by the sight of this ration that we called it desecrated vegetables. And that was a more accurate term for it. All of us were issued one blanket. We might have a spare shirt, a spare set of stockings, and we had a rubberized sheet of cloth that made either a good ground cloth, because you turned the rubberized side down to the ground and it kept the wet and the damp away from you when you're lying in it, or if it had a cut through the middle, you would drape it over you and you'd have a poncho of sorts. It didn't protect all of you. It came out to about here and down to below your waist, front and back. But again, as when so many things that we put up with for those years, it was a lot better than nothing. And you would roll up your shirt, your trousers, your extra shirt, maybe your Bible, writing paper, other things, roll them up in the blanket, or rather roll them up in the poncho or ground cloth, and then roll the blanket around that and tie off the end. So you had a pretty large tube that you would put over your left shoulder, always your left shoulder, because when you were using your musket, you were firing with the butt on your right shoulder, and it would get in the way otherwise. So again, you would carry this yourself, come rain or shine, it's what you had. And it worked pretty well. Now I'll talk about the weapon. People are always asking me, what was it like to be in battle? After all, that's why you joined the Army, isn't it? To go and kill the Secesh. Well, if I had known what things were going to be like, and I was not alone in this perspective, I would have deserted. But as it was, I signed up initially for 3 months or 90 days service. The war lasted a lot longer than 3 months. But the thing was, at the end of that initial period, many regiments of men had had enough, and they left. They marched away to go home. And that was perfectly legal for them to do. They'd signed the paper or made their mark for 3 months service. It was over. Go home. Fortunately, a lot of us stayed in. By the time the opportunity to re-enlist came around in 1864, I'd been through a lot and seen a lot. Had friends who were wounded or killed. I was fortunate not to suffer anything like that myself, and I credit divine providence in that regard. But I decided to see the thing through, and I re-enlisted. For doing that, I got a little pin with MICH, Michigan, the name of my state, on it to wear. Not in battle, but for parades and so on. I got a month's leave at home, which was very pleasant. And I got a bonus. I got some cash. So overall, it was an all right thing for me to do. But one more piece of clothing I need to talk to you about is this. Out of Uncle Sam's thoughtfulness, whenever we went into winter camp, which was usually from November to perhaps early May, when the roads were too muddy for us to march, too muddy for cavalry to go out, and too muddy for wagons or artillery, the two armies pretty much left one another alone. We would go into static camps, and we would, with very rare instances, have nothing to do with each other. Yes, there were times both armies have guards out called pickets, and they might meet together at banks of a river to talk a bit, and the Rebs always wanted northern newspapers. The Yankees always wanted southern tobacco. So it was a very equitable situation. But when we went into winter camp, thankfully we didn't just live in tents, because it would have been too wet. Even if it didn't snow, it would have rained a lot. So all we do is dig a rectangle into the ground, about waist height. Then we would visit a nearby farm or house, and we would liberate clapboards or other kinds of wood to build walls higher up to about maybe shoulder. Then, you remember me talking about those shelter halves. Two of us would button them up, throw it over a ridgepole, and then tie it down, making a roof. We would have an opening at one end, an entrance, and we tack up one of our blankets for that to keep out the wind. And then we would also, because we were going to do our own cooking often, we would make a fireplace. We would rely on the friendship of Southern families to give us bricks out of which we could make a fireplace. And then for a chimney, there were kind of two general things we did. Either we might get a couple of empty barrels from the quartermaster, put one on top of the other, and put that at the apex of the roof for a chimney. Or we might have to put together pieces of wood, twigs, to be a chimney. Those often caught fire. So what do? You go outside, knock the burning wood off, and start all over again. Inside, we would build bunks for ourselves. We would put tree boughs on those. We might put hay on the floor to keep out the damp and wet. We would put in pegs for lanterns, our equipment, other things, in the walls round about. But even with all that, it was possible to get cold and uncomfortable, particularly if you're going out on picket. So, as I started to say, Uncle Sam, recognizing the need, gave us this item. It's called a greatcoat. It doesn't have the name greatcoat because it was wonderful, although it was. It's called a greatcoat because it's big. It goes over your jacket. You can button it up securely. It doesn't have pockets, but that's all right. It's got a good collar to go around your neck. And it has a cape. The utility of the cape was, if you're laying down, you can pull this up over your head, and it keeps your head warm. Now, we also got sent a lot of things from home during winter camp. After all, we were going to be there 4 or 5 months. So there's plenty of time for the mails and express boxes full of goodies from home to come to us. And these had all manner of things. Sometimes soap for no reason, I don't know. We weren't very much in favor of washing at that time. And jam, and clothing, books, and sometimes alcohol. Now, we weren't supposed to have alcohol, even though our friendly settlers, who also took up residence in the winter camps, would be happy to sell it to us. But the Army had officers whose job it was, in part, to go through our express boxes and take out any alcohol that they found. And no doubt, in many cases, that liquid graced the tables of the officers' mess. They weren't going to just throw it away. But we knew the officers were hunting for this stuff. And we became inventive in trying to find ways to fool them. So people at home might take a small bottle of brandy and put it in a cake. They might take a larger bottle of spirits and insert it into a cooked turkey or chicken. And we would know to look in those objects for what we really wanted more often than cakes or roasted fowl. So during the time in winter camp, all these things came to us. Mostly useful, because we told the folks at home what we really needed and what we didn't have. Some were not so useful. But then, when the time came to leave winter camp, to go on campaign again, to get back to our work, if you had been in one of Professor Lowey's gas balloons suspended above an army leaving its winter camp, you would have seen a remarkable sight. As the troops marched out away from the camp and they progressed along. On either side of the road, there would be a steady accumulation of all those things that were so lovingly knitted or cooked or built from the folks at home. That was rather uncouth of us, wasn't it? But you have to remember that just as in other cases, was the army going to transport those things for us? Of course not. And so the only thing to do with them was to discard them. And that included discarding greatcoats, because were you going to need this in high summer tramping around Virginia or anywhere else? No. Again, you weren't going to carry it with you either. What to do with it? Well, we recognize the value of this item, and we didn't want the enemy, whether military or civilian, to pick it up and put it to their own use. So we would take a knife, or, once again, the soldier's friend, our bayonets, and we would shred the coat so there was of absolutely no use to man or beast, and throw it by the side of the road, because we knew that the government was going to give us another coat come winter. We were assured of that. And I'll pass this around so you can see just how lightweight this is. Now to talk about my weapon, and that'll be the last part of my lecture. When the war started, just as both the North and South governments were overwhelmed with men volunteering to be in the ranks, because remember, there was only going to be one battle, and then everybody would go home, and we didn't want to miss that. But those governments lacked the wherewithal to supply those troops. They didn't have uniforms. They didn't have shoes. They didn't have leathers or hats. Most of all, they didn't have weapons. So for a while, particularly in the South, men went into the army ranks carrying their squirrel rifles, their shotguns, their grandpa's flintlock that might have been carried again in the Revolutionary War or the Mexican War. And both the North and South governments sent agents into Europe scouring the countryside for stocks of weapons. Maybe they were stored away in some castle, and they would offer money for them, and the prince or whoever would be more than happy to be done with them. And these were all shipped across the ocean and all thrust upon the hapless soldier. But then, as things got more organized, both armies started receiving more standard weapons, like this. Now this is an Enfield rifle musket. It was manufactured in Great Britain. Over here in Stamford, Connecticut, there's a company called Springfield that produced a weapon that's almost the exact copy of this. What were the advantages of this kind of weapon? If everybody, so to speak, has the same kind of weapon, you had uniformity in ammunition and tools to work on them. The armorers knew how to take care of them because they could do it in their sleep. There was nothing unusual. They were all the same. So by this Eli Whitney Fellow's idea of mass production, we all got these weapons. Now, the musket that my forebears carried in earlier wars, as I said, were smooth bore. The interior of the muzzle was flat. So you would drop, you would put in the powder and some other things, then you would drop on top of it the ball. And then you would take the rammer and ram the projectile as far as you could down to the base of the barrel, because you wanted very little room between the projectile and the gunpowder when it went off. Then you would half cock it, and I said in those times there was a little pan that stuck out here, and you would fill that with powder from a little container, perhaps on your belt or in your cartridge box. You'd snap the cover over it until it came time for use. Again, you took off that cover, and the wind might blow away the powder. The rain or snow might get it wet so it wouldn't go off. But what were you going to do? In my day, there had been a great technological advance in that regard. The rounds that we used were, instead of being round lead balls, there was a French officer named Claude Binet who developed a new kind of projectile. It's shaped like a cone, which made it go through the air faster, and therefore it would be of harm to the enemy at a greater distance. In addition to that shape, in the base there's an open space, and what would happen is when you fired the gunpowder, the gas from the gunpowder would go in that and expand the projectile, which made it grip the interior of the muzzle, which had grooves cut into it when it was manufactured. And that made the projectile go farther at a higher velocity. Pass around one of these. So my weapon, my Enfield, has a shoulder strap. A lot of times they didn't. The Army issued them, or the Army didn't issue them. I have a cross on the butt of my weapon because I became a Christian after the war. But if I had had this on the weapon during my service, I could have been court-martialed and shot. It was against the rules. So, you take the round. One more thing that was important when we joined the Army, we did receive somewhat of a medical examination. I think today they become a lot more in extent. But the surgeon would pound your chest to make sure your lungs were good. He'd have you run around to make sure you had wind, because you needed to be able to run or march long distances. And the thing we didn't expect was he would check our front teeth. Were we horses? No. But we had to be mustered into the Army. We had to have 4 front teeth. Why? Well, the rounds we were given was a paper tube with wadding and gunpowder and the bullet, like it's going around. A lot of these, by the way, were manufactured in factories whose workers were women and children. And on more than one occasion, there was an explosion in one of these armories. There was one near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it made for great loss of life and injuries. So it wasn't just soldiers out on the field or sailors at sea who faced the possibility of great harm, but a lot of other people did too. But back to 4 teeth. You can see that this round has a little tail sticking up. And you needed those 4 teeth because to start the process of loading your weapon, you had to pull off the tail. Then you had access to what's inside, and then you would put the steel rammer down in. Now, one thing about battle is, for good or for ill, it was exciting. There were people over there who were trying to kill you. Come on. What could be more exciting than that? And it wasn't unusual when a battle had lasted for a while or was very heated for fellows to forget to remove the rammer after they pushed down the round. So they would half cock it, put on the percussion cap, bring it to full cop, and either be told or be given permission just to fire. And when that happened, this became like a crossbow bolt used in medieval times. It would fly around, twisting in the air, and it might stick in the ground. It might stick in a tree. A lot of times, it's stuck in a man. Now, even though we had better weapons than earlier generations of Americans, we weren't taught how to be marksmen. There were special troops that learned how to do that and kill people better than we ever did. But it really wouldn't have been much use for us to be trained. The powder, the gunpowder, whether for pistols or muskets or artillery, was not smokeless. And what that meant was, as soon as an engagement started, the air would be full of powder, clouds of gray, black powder. What could you do to shoot at the enemy? How could you perceive them? Well, I understand that during the Revolution, officers said, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. I don't know how anybody ever did that. Because once the clouds started, if it was a humid day, it might hang in the air. It might never come down. But we had to have our orders. So it was like this. When it was known that the enemy was coming toward us, marching toward us to engage closely, our officers would say, fire when you see their feet. Because all that smoke, generally speaking, did not go all the way to the ground. And you knew when you saw a line of boots coming toward you, that above the boots, there was a body. And that's what you were aiming for. Now, one final thing I'll say about this weapon is there's an organization that came about during Reconstruction time that you might have heard of, and people often liken its name as being derived from firing the musket. It went like this: Ku Klux Klan. I don't know whether that's necessarily the truth, but it has received a great deal of currency. That's all I would say to you. Thank you for coming.